Hello and welcome back to the Ideal Wealth Grower YouTube channel. My name is Axel Meyer-Höfer and I'm going to be the host of today's episode. And this is basically a continuation in our last video. Remember, we talked about the inventory crunch and I said there will be a few follow-ups. And the first one I want to do in reaction to Keith Weinhold, who did a little series on his podcast, Get Rich Education, which I really enjoy and really recommend for other people to follow when you're interested in real estate investing. And he looked at, or wanted to look at, actually, what would be things that could be done to overcome the inventory crunch. Last video, I explained where the inventory crunch comes from and that it didn't just start last year or the year before or through and by the pandemic or anything like that. It really evolved, as a little recap from last time. It evolved basically since the financial crisis. And in the last video, I gave the reasons why, but in a nutshell, the financial institutions made it harder to get loans, both for people who wanted to buy properties as well as for developers, so that they could develop larger scale housing developments. The second thing is a lot of the developers that were in operations between 2005 and 2010 really got burned because the financial institutions and the market and the associations and everybody was telling them that there would be a massive market continue to be there. And as you know, from the day when you say you want to develop an empty property into a housing development for apartments or single family houses or anything like that, it takes at least 4 to 5 years, in some states even up to 8 to 10 years. So with the expectation that the market and the demand would be there, large developments were started, and then the crisis hit and the developers were not able to actually get people to buy these houses, and they were competing with massive amounts of foreclosures. So some of those things all led to the fact that we have that inventory crunch right now, and it was accelerated and deepened and worsened due to the fact that last year, during the pandemic, there was basically no way to build anything more. But in general terms, when you think about it, what could we do if we had the chance to basically look at it like a reset, right? And one thing that is definitely helpful now is that interest rates are low and that the Federal Reserve and everybody else who is lending money is committing and has committed to keep them low. Now, will that really work or not is still out for answering, because I personally believe the interest rates staying low, while we all can see that inflation is coming back, that prices are rising all over the place, not just in real estate, because in real estate, you could argue the properties or the prices for the properties is rising because there's really low demand. But in most other cases, there is pent up demand. So it's not just that we suddenly don't know how to produce certain products anymore, but there is more demand for that than was anticipated. And there have been suppressed prices in the past. So now all of this is all happening at the same time, and prices are increasing for all kinds of food items, for gas, for your utility bills, and on and on and on. So when prices are basically increasing all across the board, the normal reaction of the monetary system is to increase interest rates to calm down the economy and to calm down the demand, because as interest rates increase, then it would actually be harder for people to spend as much, because the cost for doing things and manufacturing things and so forth would increase. So the word is still out, but underlying the current situation is we have a low interest rate environment, and we have commitments on the city level, on the county level, on the state level, and now also on the federal level, that something needs to be done to infrastructure, and residential building is part of that. So when you say, okay, well then great, in a few years we will start catching up to this demand, to this crunch that we are experiencing right now. And that would also mean you don't really necessarily need to wait until millions of new properties are available. When people get confidence that there is a lot of new building going on, new permitting is going on, then human nature would dictate that people will ask themselves, okay, is it a smart move to currently purchase a property, get into a new place, even though the price might be relatively expensive, when I know that there will be new inventory being available next year or 2 years from now, and probably at a lower price relative, especially when it's new versus already existing. Now, right now, it is completely unpredictable to what extent more permitting and more building and more inventory will be available. And it's also pretty clear it's not going to be anytime soon, because with the pandemic just basically subsiding, it will take a while to get the whole building industry going, even just to the level that it existed before. And to overcome the crunch that we are experiencing, it would actually have to produce and build way more than what has been built in the past. Because as you remember from the last video, there's also a pent-up demand on population growth. The United States is a country where the population is growing every year, and the building inventory crunch has basically developed also partially because way less than just to keep up with this increase in people basically wanting to live in houses has happened for about 10 years, and you don't pick that up. Let's say it's somewhere in the 5 to 10 million units that haven't been built in the last 10 years. There is no way that that is going to be made up anytime very quickly. Now, so like I said, Keith actually looked at what are some of the options that could help. And he looked at, number one, an alternative to regular wood frame stick building houses, like you see anytime you see any building, or most of the time you see any building development here in the United States, you see basically 2x4 or 2x6 stick frame housing built. And you have probably all heard this crazy situation in the lumber supply or wood supply because of all kinds of reasons and machinations that happened during the pandemic. Wood is expensive as never before. Some people say it adds between 16 and 25% in cost to the regular price. If you were to buy or build a house just right at the beginning of the pandemic at the prices for lumber then, and you build the exact same house now with prices for lumber now, you're looking at 16 to 25% higher cost, just because the price of wood has completely skyrocketed, exploded basically. But that has been and still is the main, most prevalent way of building houses in the United States. And that's true both for apartment complexes and for single family residences, duplex, triplex, fourplex, the stuff that we are actually recommending for our clients and investors to invest in, both renovated and new. So Keith looked at that and said, okay, what other alternatives are there? And he first looked at containers. And shipping containers, just for those of you who are not familiar with it, there are millions and millions and millions of shipping containers, especially through the last 10, 15, 20 years, because our economy has basically become globalized. And a lot of the products that we are using on a daily basis are not manufactured in the United States. They're manufactured in other places, one of the biggest ones being China. So how do these goods come to us? They're produced in China, or sometimes they're produced in Japan or in South Korea or something like that. If it's not a huge item like a car, where they build specific ships to put the cars in and then ship them over, anything else that is smaller than like a car gets put into a container, typically already boxed up, like from a TV set to any kind of cooking ware to all kinds of clothing wear and so forth and so forth. All is boxed up in cardboard boxes and then put into a container. The containers get stacked high on special container ships and they come over. Now, these containers are built in such high quantities and they are made out of metal that it is actually cheaper to make a new container in China and then use it to fill it up, put it on a ship and ship it over to the United States than shipping it back. So what actually has happened is that shipping containers are piling up here on our shores for certain uses in country, but not really, at least not all the time, being used to go back on another ship that goes in the opposite direction to be refilled. So there's a huge amount of available shipping containers, and the containers are relatively new these days. They're not been used multiple times for years before you can buy them. They're relatively new, oftentimes have only been used once, or maybe they came with a ship and then were put on a train and stuff, but they're relatively new, which means they are not very much used. They haven't been exposed too much to the elements and stuff like that. And they're built extremely sturdy, right? Really, really sturdy construction. They withstand pretty much anything. Imagine you have a container sitting on top of a ship and going through the ocean. So that's a pretty harsh environment, and these things are built very, very well for that. So these containers cost you, if you were to buy just the container as it is, anywhere from about $3,500 to about $7,500. And the containers typically are 40 feet long and 9 feet or about 9 feet high. So a good friend of mine, Leslie Horn, created a company probably a decade ago. I don't know exactly the date, to specialize in taking these boxes, these containers, and converting them in living spaces and business spaces. And she has successfully created the business in Detroit, and they're building residential real estate out of containers. They're building apartment complexes and student dormitories out of containers, and even larger apartment complexes up to 5 or 6 containers high. The biggest issue she was facing initially was to get permits to actually use the containers as the building material, because it was different than what all the other regulations and rules and what was common. And as you know, that's one of the things that we're always running into when somebody wants to do something new. Then first everybody said crazy, will never happen. Then there is a certain phase of astonishment that is, oh, this is kind of interesting, looks different, feels different. I wonder if it's going to work. And then it becomes genius. Well, why haven't other people thought about it before? But that's only after the people who started go through all the pain. Leslie has gotten to that point where she worked her way through all that pain and all that permitting and stuff like that, and is one of the companies who is successfully offering containers. When Keith reviewed that, he only used one example from a company called JWB in Jacksonville, which is a great provider for turnkey properties that anybody who is interested in turnkey investing should take a look at. And they did one project. So for me, that's one of my critiques on Keith's review, is that's pretty disingenuous to take one example from somebody you know who tried this one time, no experience whatsoever, and came to the conclusion it's nice, it's well adopted, people like it, but it was equally, if not more expensive than the regular building. Now, what would I say to that? For one, if you are in the early stages of something, it is always more expensive than when it becomes commonplace. If any one of you listening to what did it cost, and I'm assuming typical listeners here are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, maybe late 20s, if you go back to the very first computer that you had, or that your parents got for you, or that you bought for yourself, and you look right now online at Amazon or Dell or Apple or so, what a computer, if you were to look, if you were even able to find one that has a similar capability like the one that you first bought, nowadays you would probably not find it. You will find a computer that is multiple times better in capability than what your first one was for a fraction of the price of the first one. And why is that? Because when the technology is relatively new, it's more expensive. There is not mass production. There is not all the advancements made. And this is not just in computers. This is true for all kinds of things. Look at TVs. How expensive were TVs? Nowadays, you get all kinds of new technologies with amazing sizes at amazingly low prices. It's the evolution and the maturing of the technology. So to say container building, because it's definitely not commonplace yet, is expensive, is only true in the sense of it hasn't really been given the chance to become more commonplace. But there's one thing that I believe is important, and that is we are not, and I think that's one of the things I'm a little bit irked about with Keith's review, is it doesn't really help to look at the whole situation of this inventory crunch and say, okay, can container building with containers replace or increase the inventory? And replace, definitely not. Increase, I believe, yes. if there were some support, whenever we have something new that we want to do, it is necessary that there is some support. So when, for example, we first started to put solar panels on our roofs, the government gave us a solar credit, a solar tax credit. When the first electric cars came out, every company that produces electric cars, because they are more environmentally friendly, were given 200,000 cars for when somebody, you and I or anybody else, buys a car from a company that has not sold 200,000 electric cars. For each car, you get a tax credit, which actually means in some cases up to $7,000. So you buy a $40,000 electric car and you get $7,000 back. So it's really a $33,000 car. So every single time, and there's multiple examples like that, where either industry or consumers got help. So if we were, for example, to go and say, okay, we want to do more container building, using containers, get more companies to be familiar with how to actually handle the containers, get the containers prepared, get the materials and the insulation for the containers, make everything more mainstream, it would definitely add to the proliferation of container building in addition to the traditional building. So that's definitely one thing that I believe is necessary. The other part that I want to point out is to these alternative methods. What I think is really, really perplexing to me as somebody who originally came from Europe is that we are not mandating certain things in certain locations to be used more prevalent and being supported more where it absolutely makes sense. Every single year that I've lived in the United States, and anybody who has lived all their life here in the United States can see between sometime in June, July until November, some weather report about Florida and the Florida coast and the New Orleans area and stuff like that, where another hurricane or tropical storm moved in and ripped apart another neighborhood. And then they have to be rebuilding. And when you look, what has been ripped apart in the most vast majority of cases is wood frame stick-built houses. Well, if you were to make regular concrete foundations and secure shipping container built houses on it, there wouldn't be anywhere near that damage, if any at all. Because these containers are much more sturdy and cannot easily be ripped apart, they don't fall apart, a hurricane is not going to lift them up and take them away or anything like that. No roofs will be flying off, nothing. So it perplexes me to say, why are we not mandating when we're rebuilding any place in the last 25 years that has been impacted to use building methods that are not improvements on wood stick frame housing, but something that is inherently more resistant and sturdy, like a shipping container. So I believe that would be a huge addition to traditional building, and especially should be mandated and supported in locations that are prone to those kind of natural disasters. By the way, you could even argue to think about it because shipping containers are also much less affected by wildfires. Now, will there be no damage at all? No, but it's not going to burn down. You're not going to burn down a metal-made shipping container when there's a wildfire. That doesn't mean you let the fire rage through the location or the development, but what is remaining is livable space, most likely, rather than basically flattened earth like we've seen in Oregon and in Washington State and California in the last few years. So shipping containers, I believe, have great potential. The next thing that Keith looked at was 3D printed houses. And that is a methodology, just to recap that, where you basically have a hose that is computer programmed and a special kind of concrete that is basically building the walls of a house layer by layer, and each layer is about 2 to 3 inches thick. And so there is a certain computer program that has exactly the design of the house, and within a few days, this concrete system can basically print the house. If anybody of you has seen any kind of 3D printing of any kind, just imagine that on a larger scale, and you print a house, and instead of using some plastic material or stuff like that, you're using concrete. Now, is that very prevalent? No, this is even more modern, even newer as an idea, as something to do than the shipping container. Shipping container building has been around for about 15 years now, I would say. This 3D printing, because the technology and the special kind of concrete hasn't been around that long. Keith dismissed it basically because he claimed that it, for one, was too complicated, that it could only be done in dry weather conditions, which is not true, and that the amount of people that would be interested to adopt this is low. And the last part, that the amount of people adopting it is low, is true, which is again another good argument to say we need an accelerator. We need support if we want to actually add to the different kinds of way to build residential and apartment real estate and add to the traditional way, then we need an accelerator and support from the government. So it would mean, why not give companies an incentive to try 3D printed houses? Now, the thing about it is, why is that particularly interesting? Because with 3D printed houses, you basically build the house much, much faster. So you prepare everything, you do all your utility stuff and your concrete foundation, and then the house, the main part of the house, is printed in a few days, and you can have the roof structure ready, and you put the roof structure on it, and I would say at the very most in 2 weeks the house is done, at least as far as the house is there. And putting windows and doors in is not going to take very long. Yes, there will be still some work on the inside, but overall the time to actually get the house to a much more finished state much quicker is possible. And again, you end up with a concrete built house. All the walls are concrete. Yes, there's still a chance that your roof could be ripped away by a hurricane if you put it somewhere in Florida, but you still have a concrete structure where all you would need to do is put a new roof on instead of the whole house being gone. And it will be extremely safe inside because literally concrete walls like a bunker. So another good reason to think, should there be more help, more incentive, and should it be more mandated to take these alternative methods like container houses or 3D printed concrete built houses over wood frame stick built houses? Now, one other thing I wanted to point out, and that is become very prevalent in Europe in all kinds of facets, and I want to encourage anybody who is interested in this overall topic of what are different kinds of ways of building properties for myself or as investment properties, look into some European sites to see what they're actually doing, and that goes in the direction of manufactured housing. And I don't really know why, but for some reason, it has always basically been brought in the context of trailer homes and trailer parks and stuff like that. And even though you could maybe make an argument that 40, 50 years ago that was the case, number one, more than 20 years ago, a law was passed that no new trailer parks are basically permitted in the United States. But the other thing is there is a difference between putting what's called a single wide trailer on some wheels, haul it into a place and put it down and say, okay, this thing can be moved away again. And you're basically renting the space on which your trailer is sitting, and that is your housing. Versus modern manufactured homes, where you have a normal foundation, normal utilities. The house is built in a factory in a huge covered space away from the elements. And when everything is complete, it's get put on really huge trailers and put on site. And typically, the more sophisticated manufactured homes take about, depending if it's single story or two story, single story takes about 3 to 4 days, two story about a full week, like Monday through Sunday, or maybe a week and a half if you stop over the weekend, to put the whole house, everything included in it. And it has literally everything. It has floors, it has your kitchen is in it, your bathrooms are in it, all your finishes are in it, the doors, the windows, the roof, everything is manufactured in the factory. Now, for one, again, if you look across the regions where actually housing happens, how many times have you seen that a whole building site got inundated either in the wintertime by snow and they had to stop working, or it rains? Like if you're building in like Portland, Oregon, or somewhere in Washington State or somewhere in the Northeast, you have phases even in the summertime where the weather is fundamentally good, but you have rainstorms and all kinds of stuff going through the building site. Well, if you do manufactured housing at an accelerated rate, if there were incentives to do this at the modern technology that is actually available. And again, I know, for example, one company not very far from me is called Silvercrest, who does beautiful houses. And I would encourage anybody who is interested, just go on their website and look at the vast a broad spectrum of different houses, different styles, different kinds of options that they have. But they are still child's play compared to what European housing manufacturers are actually doing. And they get environmental and insulation values that go far beyond what you get with regular stick frame building. So manufactured houses could be manufactured at a much, much larger scale. And you can work in parallel. While the houses are being built in the factory, you can prepare a huge site with all the foundations all at once. And then you just bring one truck after the next and set the houses down. And I bet you when you actually do it the right way, people wouldn't even be able to see the difference that one is stick frame built regular and one is manufactured housing built. And you have built in perfect building conditions at a much faster rate with oftentimes better insulation values and better stability values than the regular stick frame house. So that's another really big opportunity to bring variety, but also additional inventory to the market very quickly. And when you think about all of those, let me see what else do I have here. There is, when we all complain about wood being so expensive, in commercial real estate, a lot of the buildings are actually done with steel frame. So it has really escaped me, but it's probably a matter of things have to do with resistance to change, and we will do another video about that when it comes to what is the kind of inventory that people are actually interested in. But one of the things that I see is that it's weird to me that in commercial building, we use metal frame quite a bit. But when we say, okay, we have a massive increase in prices for wood, for basically 2x4s and 2x6, why not replace them by metal? Because you can do sheetrock walls with insulation the same way on a metal frame as you can on a wood frame. But it's not that common in residential real estate. So that's definitely one. And then the one thing that is probably kind of hopping back a little bit from when I was a little boy and was always interested in looking at, how building, I've always loved to watch a building come together or construction and stuff like that. And where I grew up, it was completely normal to build with brick and mortar. And to some extent, I really have to say, it seems to me that masonry and the ability to really build a house brick and mortar has basically become a lost art in the United States. My parents actually built our first house, a brick and mortar, not by themselves, but by a builder. But because of that, I had the opportunity, it was a new development, to see a lot of other houses in that new development coming up out of the ground at the same time like ours was being built. And they were all built brick and mortar. And what was really fascinating, if I look today, what it takes a builder in the United States to build a stick frame house, and I look at what it took in time, purely time, on building a brick and mortar house in Germany at the time, these guys, these bricklayers and builders, they were so fast, they were so experienced that the time it took them to do the inner walls and then the outer brick walls and put the insulation in between was about the same like a stick frame house. Literally, in the inner walls were built in a week and the outer walls in another week. And about 5 inches insulation space in between. And then you put a roof on. There's also one other thing, by the way, that is kind of interesting. What they did already 26, 30 years ago, when that happened, is they basically put a concrete ceiling in. So if you build a 2-story house, you have no transition of any noise between the ground floor and the upper floor. That would be something to consider. Why don't we do this in our building? Because we like huge open spaces. I love those too. But the bigger the span is and you have wood on either side, the harder it is to actually cross that space. And the only way that you can make this legally happen here is with huge metal T-frames. And that is really, really expensive, much more expensive than wood. So we go to the maximum opening that we can have, and then we put wooden beams across. But they transition any kind of walking, jumping, and stuff like that through the ceiling to the lower floor. If you have either 3D printed concrete walls or you have brick and mortar walls, you can put prefabricated concrete frames as floors on the ceiling and there is no transition. It's super quiet. And by the way, it's also much easier to do floor heating on the upper floor by just putting it on the concrete ceiling. So those are some of the options. And for me, why I'm actually a little bit critical about Keith's review is that he brought just one example of each and ultimately basically came to the conclusion based on those examples, one single one, it is not really, or those examples are not really an alternative. And I don't agree with that. I believe if there were enough both taxation incentives, financing incentives, and other incentives, especially for the builders, but also for anybody considering to buy these properties, and you can put them under contract, you could really make developments. I'm not saying any one of those things that we just discussed should replace the traditional building. But two things should really be considered. Number one is what locations would benefit from these alternative building methods, not so much because they are cheaper or better or so forth, but because they are more suitable for the location. Especially 3D printed concrete houses and container houses in locations that are every year inundated with hurricanes and wildfires and other natural disasters, I believe strongly should get an incentive and support to be more prevalent than just the exception. And in general, if you think about all of these, if you think about the containers, the 3D printed houses, the manufactured houses, the brick and mortar, the steel frame, all these alternatives that I just went through, and they were all supported together with what we're doing, that I believe would give us an opportunity to overcome the crunch that we are experiencing right now and get back to a situation where you have a good balance of supply and demand. By the way, the number is measured typically in how much inventory is actually in the market, is measured at how often is the market turning over. And so what you want to normally get to is about 6 to 7 months worth of inventory. So that means there is enough properties out there for sale that would be necessary to supply the market for 6 to 7 months. Right now, we're basically 30 days or something like that. Right? The market turns over that quickly, or there's so little inventory and so much demand that anything that comes up is sold in 30 days or less. So think about it. There are alternatives to this current situation. Now, anything that has to do with building always takes quite a bit of time. So don't expect this to be changing super quickly. I don't think the prices will come down anytime this year and probably not even next year. The only thing could be that they either get too high and less people can actually afford them, or the other option would be that the interest rates start increasing and so the monthly payment that you would have to make would get too expensive. In any case, there are alternatives, and I don't agree with Keith that we should dismiss them or think that it will take another decade. It is really a matter of, do we really want to use these alternatives and do something about the situation, or do we just let it linger and stick with what we're familiar with? That's always the biggest issue. As long as we just stick with what we're familiar with, we're also stuck with the problem. If we are willing to look at alternatives and let them exist and let them actually develop while we still keep doing what we're familiar with, we have a chance to do better in the future. So I hope you appreciate this video as a follow-up to the last one, and I want to also look at the human component in another video in the future. So for now, if you're not already a subscriber, please hit the subscribe button. If you like our videos, ring the notification bell so that you get notified when we have a new video. Give it a thumbs up so the YouTube algorithm knows that you appreciated it, and share it with your network. And one thing I want to also mention is, going forward, we would like to do interview style videos. So if you or somebody you know is interested in doing an interview with me about real estate and building and financing and lending and our out-of-state residential real estate investment strategy, then please let me know in the comments so that we can reach out and set up an appointment. So be well, stay safe, and I see you in the next video.